In today's episode, we explore a haunting tale of power and obsession. A police officer's unhealthy obsession with an 18-year-old girl takes a dark turn, leading to a devastating outcome. Join us as we uncover the unsettling details of this tragic case and explore how a dangerous obsession led to death. Laker Green, an 18-year-old with her future ahead of her, had just graduated from Franklin High School in Livonia, Michigan, and was working part-time at a local Denny's to save for community college. Laker dreamed of becoming a nurse, driven by her mother's fight with cancer years earlier. Her family remembered her as kind and compassionate, always bringing warmth to any room she walked into. She lived with her father, Richard Green, an insurance adjuster, in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. A few months before her tragic death, Laker's life changed unexpectedly when she met Officer James Jim Brody. Brody, 35, was a seasoned police officer with 10 years of service in Livonia. Their encounter began when he responded to a noise complaint at her home. Friends say Brody was polite and professional during the initial visit, but he soon began striking up casual conversations with Laker, which eventually developed into a relationship. At first, Laker seemed flattered by his attention. He would visit her at Denny's, leaving generous tips and offering to walk her to her car after his shifts. As time went on, their relationship grew more intimate. Laker confided in a close friend that while Brody was charming, he could also be overbearing, frequently texting her several times a day to keep track of her whereabouts. Their relationship became sexual during the summer of 2012. Friends began to notice a change in Laker. She had once been outgoing and full of energy, but now she seemed more withdrawn and anxious. She would frequently glance over her shoulder as though she feared someone was watching her. Brody's possessiveness grew stronger, leaving Laker feeling trapped and unsure of how to end the relationship. Things took a more complicated turn when she discovered she was pregnant in early August. After taking a home pregnancy test from a local Walgreens, she confided in her best friend about the news. Laker wasn't sure who the father was, Brody or her ex-boyfriend, Cameron Hall. Her relationship with Cameron had been rocky, marked by his possessiveness and constant efforts to win her back after their breakup. The uncertainty of the situation weighed heavily on Laker in the days leading up to her death. Laker poured her fears into her journal, expressing how overwhelmed and uncertain she felt about her future. She was especially concerned about how Brody would react to the news, aware of his temper and controlling behavior. In her final days, Laker was consumed by anxiety and dread, trying to navigate the complexities of her relationships while facing the daunting reality of becoming a teenage mother. On August 22, 2012, the summer heat in Livonia, Michigan was intense, with temperatures reaching around 85 degrees. At approximately 3:30 p.m., local realtor Sharon Whitaker was getting ready to show a foreclosed home on Arborview Drive to a potential buyer. The house had been vacant for months, neglected and falling into disrepair, standing out in contrast to the well-kept homes in the surrounding suburban neighborhood. "Hey!" came that made her stop in her tracks, a few houses down from the old distribution center with an all-traffic light. Something would be quicker to persist in previous instances. Caught her eye. Something that made her stop in the tracks level. Lying on the cold concrete floor was the lifeless body of a young woman. Sharon instantly knew it wasn't an accident or a natural death. The woman's face was pale, and there were visible marks around her neck, suggesting something far more sinister had occurred. The body seemed to have been carelessly left there, with no attempt to conceal it. Sharon's client, a middle-aged man, froze in shock, slowly retreating toward the staircase. Sharon, struggling to keep her composure, managed to dial 911, her hands shaking as she explained what she had discovered. "I think it's a murder," she told the operator, her voice shaking. "There's a young woman here in the basement. She's not breathing." The call was short, but Sharon's voice trembled as she gave the address. When the police arrived, she and her client were standing outside on the lawn, both clearly shaken. Sharon later told reporters from the Detroit Free Press that the image of the body would haunt her forever. Within minutes, Livonia police officers arrived at the scene. The basement was cordoned off, and detectives began their initial investigation. The victim was soon identified as 18-year-old Laika Green. Laika was found in a fetal position, her hands gently curled by her side. A preliminary examination revealed she had been strangled, and there were no signs that her body had been moved after death. Word of the discovery spread rapidly through the neighborhood, with residents quietly gathering at a distance, whispering in shock and disbelief. Many in the neighborhood were shocked, unable to grasp that such a horrific crime could happen so close to home. For Laika's family, however, the nightmare was only just beginning. The Livonia police responded quickly to the scene at the abandoned house on Arborview Drive, with Detective Mark Calhoun, who was secretly gay, leading the investigation. Detective Calhoun, known for his meticulous and no-nonsense approach, had solved many cases in the Livonia area, but none as unsettling as this one. Officers swiftly secured the scene, draping yellow crime tape across the front yard as curious neighbors lingered at a distance. The scene itself was grim but appeared relatively undisturbed. There was no blood at the scene, and the only visible signs of trauma were the bruising around Laika's neck, indicating she had been strangled. Her body was found curled in a fetal position, her eyes closed, and her hands resting loosely by her sides. Detectives observed no signs of a struggle, which led them to believe she may have been caught off guard by her attacker. Forensic technicians from the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office arrived soon after to collect evidence. They carefully gathered samples from Laika's body and clothing, searching for any trace of DNA, fibers, or fingerprints that could point to a suspect. Meanwhile, detectives scoured the house, collecting any potential evidence that might help reconstruct the events leading up to Laika's death. When Laika's body was transported to the morgue, a routine autopsy and toxicology screening were conducted. A few days later, the results revealed a shocking discovery. Laika had been pregnant at the time of her death. Forensic analysis confirmed the pregnancy, adding a new layer of complexity to the case. Detectives learned that Laika had kept the pregnancy a secret, not even confiding in her closest friends. This revelation raised further questions about her relationships, especially her recent involvement with Officer James "Jim" Brody and her tumultuous past with her ex-boyfriend Cameron Hall. Investigators now focused on determining the identity of the unborn child's father, hoping it might provide a motive for the murder. As the investigation unfolded, police shared their findings with the local media, and the news quickly spread throughout Livonia. The Detroit Free Press and other outlets picked up the story, reporting on the tragic twist that a young woman, just on the brink of adulthood and facing an unexpected pregnancy, had her life violently cut short. Detectives worked to piece together Laika's final days, trying to understand how and why she ended up in that abandoned basement. As the community mourned, many were left grappling with the question of what could drive someone to harm a young woman and her unborn child. As the investigation deepened, police turned their attention to Officer James "Jim" Brody, a respected 35-year-old member of the Livonia Police Department who had been closely involved in Laika's life. Brody had been open about his relationship with Laika, often describing her as the love of his life. When detectives questioned him, he remained composed but visibly emotional, repeatedly denying any involvement in her death. "She was everything to me," he told investigators during an interview at the precinct. "I would never hurt her. I was planning to be there for her no matter what," Brody insisted. He claimed he had been at home the night Laker went missing, offering only vague details about spending the evening watching reruns of Anzias. However, Brody's calm demeanor raised suspicion among investigators, especially when he seemed to over-explain certain details of his alibi. Sensing something off, detectives decided to dig deeper into Brody's personal life and reached out to his ex-wife, Karen Brody. Karen, now living in Farmington Hills with their 2 children, was initially reluctant to speak, but eventually agreed to meet with detectives. Karen's account painted a very different picture of the man who claimed to love Laker. She described Brody as controlling and quick to anger during their marriage. "He always had to know where I was, who I was talking to, and what I was doing," she said, her voice trembling as she recalled the tense, oppressive atmosphere of their relationship. "At first it seemed like he was just protective," Karen explained. "Over time, it became suffocating. If I didn't answer his calls or texts right away, he'd show up at my work or accuse me of lying." She also revealed troubling incidents of physical intimidation, describing how Brody's anger would sometimes escalate to the point where she felt threatened. While she stopped short of accusing him of outright physical abuse, Karen recalled several instances where Brody would punch walls during arguments or grip her arm tightly enough to leave bruises. "I stayed for the kids, but eventually I realized I couldn't take it anymore," she explained, describing her decision to file for divorce 3 years earlier. Karen's statements, coupled with Brody's inability to provide solid proof of his alibi, raised serious concerns among detectives. Detectives also learned from Brody's colleagues that he had a reputation for becoming overly invested in his personal relationships, sometimes to the point of obsession. Several officers reported seeing Brody parked near Laker's neighborhood in the weeks leading up to her death, which only deepened the suspicion surrounding him. As more information came to light, Brody's image as a reliable officer began to unravel, revealing a side of him that many had never suspected. Detectives began to suspect that beneath Brody's calm exterior lay the dangerous volatility that may have led to Laker's death. Meanwhile, Cameron Hall, 19, was Laker Green's high school sweetheart. They had been together throughout much of their senior year, attending prom together in the spring of 2012, and sharing hopes and plans for the future. However, their relationship was far from stable. Friends of the couple described Cameron as intensely passionate, but also possessive. His affection for Laker often crossed into obsession, with a constant, overwhelming need for intimacy that made her uncomfortable at times. One of the key factors in their breakup was Cameron's relentless sexual demands. Laker confided in close friends that Cameron would pressure her for sex multiple times a day, sometimes asking as many as 30 times. This constant pressure left Laker feeling drained, suffocated, and ultimately forced her to distance herself from him. In early July, Laker ended their relationship, citing Cameron's inability to respect her boundaries when it came to sex. Cameron, however, did not take the breakup well. He bombarded her with long, emotional text messages, begging for another chance, and showed up unannounced at her part-time job at Denny's on several occasions, trying to win her back. Shaken but determined not to escalate things further, Laker asked Cameron to stop contacting her. When police identified him as a person of interest, they quickly noted his tumultuous history with Laker. Detective Mark Calhoun brought Cameron in for questioning just 1 day after Laker's body was discovered, eager to understand his role, if any, in her tragic death. During the interrogation, Cameron appeared nervous but cooperative. He told detectives that he had been at home, playing Call of Duty on his Xbox the night Laker was murdered. However, his alibi was flimsy. No one could verify his story. raising further doubts about his involvement in her death. The case took a shocking turn when forensic tests confirmed that Cameron was the biological father of Laker's unborn child. Armed with this new information, Detective Calhoun confronted Cameron during a second interview. His reaction was immediate and visceral. His face drained of color, and he became visibly agitated. Cameron buried his face in his hands and began to cry, repeatedly muttering, "I didn't know. She didn't tell me." He claimed he had no idea Laker was pregnant, expressing a mix of guilt and grief. "I wish she had told me," he said, "so I could have fixed things between us." Despite his apparent remorse, detectives pressed Cameron about possible motives. They asked if learning about the pregnancy could have driven him to confront Laker in anger, but he vehemently denied any involvement in her death. "I'd loved her," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I would never hurt her," Cameron insisted. However, police noted several inconsistencies in his story, especially regarding his behavior in the weeks leading up to Laker's death. Detectives uncovered a series of text messages Cameron had sent her, some of which they obtained from Laker's phone records, raising further suspicions about his actions. While many of the messages seemed apologetic, others hinted at growing frustration, with one reading, "If I can't bleep you, no one will." This cryptic and threatening message raised serious concerns among investigators. Cameron remained under close scrutiny as the investigation deepened, and detectives worked to piece together the full extent of his relationship with Laker. While Cameron's connection to Laker was undeniable, detectives struggled to find concrete evidence linking him directly to the crime scene. However, the discovery of his paternity raised serious questions about his role in Laker's life and death. The investigation took a dramatic turn on August 29, 2012, when Livonia police uncovered critical new evidence that would shift the direction of the case. The breakthrough came when detectives began reviewing Officer James Jim Brody's professional conduct. An audit of the department's systems revealed that Brody had been improperly accessing police databases for months. He had been using these resources to track Laker Green's movements, as well as those of her family and friends, raising alarming questions about his obsession and potential involvement in her death. The records revealed that Brody had searched for Laker's home address, work schedule, and even details about her ex-boyfriend, Cameron Hall. This abuse of authority painted Brody as more than just a concerned officer. It revealed a disturbing pattern of stalking and obsessive behavior that deepened the suspicion surrounding him. Detective Mark Calhoun confronted Brody about the discovery. While Brody remained calm at first, he quickly became defensive, insisting that his actions were part of an ongoing investigation. However, the absence of any official case file tied to Laker's name contradicted his explanation, leaving Brody's story increasingly questionable. The revelation about Brody's unauthorized access to police databases added considerable weight to suspicions about his involvement in Laker's death. At the same time, another crucial lead emerged from a closer examination of Laker's personal belongings. In her bedroom, investigators discovered a small, spiral-bound journal hidden beneath a stack of textbooks, which could hold key insights into her final days. The journal entries provided a disturbing window into Laker's growing fear. She wrote about feeling watched and followed, mentioning a series of anonymous, threatening notes she had received. Although the notes themselves were never found, Laker had described their contents in chilling detail, including threats that hinted at someone close to her. One entry read, "He said I'd be sorry if I didn't listen. I feel trapped. I don't know what to do." Detectives sent the journal to a forensic handwriting analyst, hoping to uncover more clues. The results were shocking. The handwriting in the journal matched samples taken from Lakers' father, Richard Green. This discovery sent the investigation in an entirely new direction. This revelation dramatically shifted the focus of the investigation. Richard Green, a 45-year-old insurance adjuster, had been openly disapproving of Lakers' relationship with Officer Brody. In fact, just weeks before her death, Richard had confronted Brody in a heated argument at the local Denny's. With this new information, investigators were faced with a complex and tangled web of motives and suspects, raising questions about what role, if any, Richard played in his daughter's tragic end. The discovery of Brody's stalking behavior and Richard's threatening notes highlighted the immense pressure Laker had been under in the weeks leading up to her death. While the case was far from being solved, these revelations provided crucial pieces of the puzzle. As the investigation deepened, Richard Green, Laker's 45-year-old father, emerged as a significant suspect, his actions raising more questions about his involvement in his daughter's tragic end. Richard was a divorced insurance adjuster known for his protective, some would say overbearing, nature toward his only daughter. While Richard denied any involvement in Laker's murder, witness accounts and neighbor testimonies painted a more troubling picture. Police learned about a heated argument between Richard and Officer James Jim Brody at a local Denny's, a popular spot in Livonia, just weeks before Laker's death. This altercation raised suspicions about the depth of Richard's animosity toward Brody, and what role, if any, it played in the tragic events that followed. On the evening of August 18, 2012, just days before Laker's death, several diners and staff at the Denny's overheard the confrontation between Richard and Officer Brody. Witnesses described the exchange as highly tense, with Richard raising his voice and pointing at Brody. One diner recalled hearing Richard shout, "Stay away from my daughter," and "You're ruining her life," suggesting that Richard's anger toward Brody had escalated to a dangerous level. This altercation added another layer of suspicion to the investigation, highlighting a potential motive for violence. Brody reportedly tried to calm the situation, but Richard's anger was unmistakable. The heated argument pointed to a deep tension between the two men, leading investigators to suspect that it might have escalated into violence. The case took a dramatic turn when new evidence emerged regarding Richard's movements on the night of Laker's murder, raising further concerns about his involvement. Richard initially told police that he had spent the evening alone at home, watching reruns of NCIS on cable. However, his story was quickly contradicted by neighbors. Several residents from his quiet suburban street reported hearing loud shouting coming from his house late that night, casting doubt on his alibi. One neighbor, who lived directly across the street, told detectives, "It was around 11 p.m. I heard yelling, a man's voice. It sounded angry, but I couldn't make out the words." Another neighbor recalled seeing Richard's porch light flicker on and off during the disturbance, indicating movement inside the house and adding further suspicion to Richard's account. Police confronted Richard about these inconsistencies, but he stuck to his story, insisting he had nothing to do with Laker's death. He acknowledged being upset about her relationship with Brody, explaining that his concern was purely for her well-being. "He's too old for her," Richard told detectives during questioning, implying that his anger stemmed from a father's protective instincts. "I just wanted her to see that," Richard insisted, claiming his actions were motivated by concern for his daughter. However, investigators became increasingly skeptical when they linked Richard's threatening notes to Laker's journal. The handwriting matched, and his inability to provide a solid alibi only deepened their suspicions, suggesting that his involvement in Laker's death was more than just a protective father's concern. While no physical evidence directly linked Richard to the crime scene, his behavior and the timeline of events kept him under close scrutiny. His tense and volatile relationships with both Laker and Brody added complexity to the case. Though Richard's actions may have been driven by a misguided sense of protection, they raised serious questions about how far he was willing to go to intervene in his daughter's life, and whether that ultimately led to tragedy. After weeks of thorough investigation, police uncovered the chilling truth. Officer James "Jim" Brody, the 36-year-old veteran cop and Laker Green's secret lover, was responsible for her death. The evidence revealed a disturbing combination of obsession, betrayal, and desperation that drove Brody to commit the crime. Brody's actions on the night of August 22, 2012, painted a chilling picture. Overcome by jealousy and a fear of his secret relationship with Laker being exposed, Brody went to her home. He was unraveling, caught between his love for her, the guilt of betraying his family, and the pressure of maintaining his image as a respected police officer. This internal turmoil pushed him to a breaking point. Investigators revealed by Laker's refusal to end things with her ex-boyfriend Cameron, as well as her decision to stop seeing him. Consumed by jealousy and fear of losing control, Brody drove his unmarked patrol car to Laker's house late that night, deliberately avoiding the neighborhood's security cameras. He let himself in using a spare key that Laker had once trusted him with, marking the start of a tragic sequence of events. To divert suspicion, Brody disposed of Laker's body in an abandoned foreclosed house on the outskirts of Livonia. The house, vacant for months, appeared to be the ideal spot to conceal her. Having come across the property through his police work, Brody knew it was largely overlooked by the public and would likely go unnoticed in the investigation. Brody carefully staged the scene to make it appear as though Laker had been the victim of a random crime, selecting the foreclosed house to suggest a botched robbery. He believed the remote location would make it less likely for anyone to question the circumstances, relying on his insider knowledge of local properties. Taking extra precautions, he wiped down any surfaces that could potentially link him to the crime, convinced that his meticulous efforts would make it nearly impossible to solve. Despite his careful attempts to cover his tracks, Brody made a critical mistake: his arrogance. He underestimated the ability of the police to piece together the evidence and the determination of those searching for Laker. Confident that his badge would shield him, he failed to realize that it would ultimately be his undoing, leading to his exposure and downfall. The breakthrough came when forensic analysis uncovered a partial shoe print near the crime scene that matched Brody's department-issued boots. Further investigation revealed that GPS data from his patrol car contradicted his alibi, showing that he had been near Laker's home around the time of her death. Additionally, detectives discovered his unauthorized use of police databases to track Laker's movements, exposing a disturbing pattern of obsessive and manipulative behavior. Confronted with the mounting evidence, Brody continued to deny his involvement, but his composure faltered when police arrested him on September 15, 2012. Witnesses recalled him as visibly shaken, his once unshakable confidence as a respected officer crumbling. "You're making a mistake," he reportedly told detectives, but his words did little to mask the reality of his situation. "I would never hurt her," Brody insisted, but investigators were certain of his guilt. In a chilling turn, they discovered his journal, hidden in his garage. The entries revealed a deep, unsettling obsession with Laker, with some passages containing veiled threats directed at anyone who might stand in his way. This final piece of evidence painted a stark picture of Brody's escalating fixation on her and his dangerous descent into violence. As Brody sat in his cell awaiting trial, he reportedly displayed a mix of anger and regret. Friends, colleagues, and the community were stunned by the revelation, struggling to reconcile the image of the trusted officer with the cold-blooded killer behind Laker's tragic death. The trial of Officer James "Jim" Brody began on March 12, 2013, at the Wayne County Courthouse, drawing widespread attention to the quiet suburb of Livonia and casting a dark shadow over the once respected police department. The case quickly captivated the public, drawing attention for its shocking combination of forbidden love, betrayal, and murder. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious locals, and friends of both the victim and the accused. Prosecuting attorney Diane Corbett opened the trial with a powerful, scathing argument. She methodically laid out the evidence, painting Brody as a jealous and controlling lover whose obsession with Laker Green had ultimately led him to take her life when he couldn't bear the thought of losing her. Corbett highlighted Brody's abuse of police resources, his obsessive surveillance of Laker, and his frantic efforts to conceal his involvement in the crime. In contrast, Brody's lawyer, Paul Langley, offered an entirely different perspective. Langley argued that Brody was innocent, dismissing the evidence as circumstantial and proposing other possible suspects, such as Cameron and Laker's father, Richard Green. He maintained that Brody was being unjustly singled out due to his connection with Laker and criticized the police for jumping to conclusions. Meanwhile, the prosecution's case relied mainly on forensic evidence. Crime scene profiles experts testified that a shoe print found at the scene matched Brody's department-issued boots, and GPS data from his patrol car placed him near Laker's home on the night of the murder. In addition, Brody's journal found in his garage showed his fixation on Laker and his increasing fear of losing her. The trial reached a tense point when the prosecution introduced threatening notes that Laker had received in the weeks leading up to her death. Although Richard Green was initially a suspect, and handwriting experts testified that the threatening notes had been written by Brody, who allegedly used them to try to pressure Laker into severing her relationship with Cameron. Throughout the trial, Brody remained composed but visibly tense. He occasionally shook his head or muttered to his attorney Langley, showing clear frustration with the prosecution's arguments. Friends and colleagues struggled to reconcile the image of the once respected officer with the man now facing charges for such a brutal crime. After several days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict on March 29, 2013. The courtroom was silent as the foreman announced the decision. Guilty of second-degree murder. Brody, who had consistently proclaimed his innocence throughout the trial, was shocked by the verdict. His defense attorney, Paul Langley, kept his composure but was clearly disappointed, struggling to come to terms with the outcome. Brody's family, who had stood by him throughout the trial, watched in stunned disbelief. The Lakers family, meanwhile, quietly wiped away tears. A sentencing hearing was set for several weeks later, where the judge, clearly affected by the emotional statements, sentenced Brody to 25 to 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Brody's family sat in silence as the sentence was announced. The former officer, once trusted to protect his community, was now facing decades in prison. The tragic death of Laker Green left the community in shock, struggling to come to terms with the loss and the betrayal by someone they had once respected. In the months after his conviction, Officer James "Jim" Brody's life took a dramatic shift. His former colleagues and the community he had once served were stunned, struggling to reconcile the man they knew with the brutal crime he had committed. Brody was sent to a high-security prison, where he quickly became a target for other inmates, now viewed as a symbol of betrayal by those who had once trusted him. As a former police officer, Brody quickly became a target in the prison system. He faced constant threats and was frequently placed in isolation for his own safety. Life in prison was brutal, and many believed that the sense of invincibility Brody had once relied on during his career could no longer shield him from the harsh realities of his new life behind bars. The weight of what he had done to Laker haunted Brody throughout his time in prison. Sources close to him reported that he often expressed regret for his actions, but by then, redemption was out of reach. He would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, a far cry from the law enforcement career he had once valued so deeply. For Cameron, Laker's ex-boyfriend, his involvement in the case was complicated. While his tumultuous relationship with Laker had drawn attention during the investigation, police ultimately cleared him of any role in her murder. Cameron, who had faced his own struggles, including a difficult sexual addiction that contributed to the breakup, was deeply shaken by Laker's death, which left him grieving and filled with guilt. Although he was never charged with any crime, the emotional weight of losing Laker and the intense scrutiny during the investigation left Cameron devastated. His life never fully recovered from the tragedy, and after the trial, he quietly faded from the public eye. Meanwhile, Richard Green, Laker's father, also became a focal point in the investigation. For weeks, Richard Green was a person of interest, primarily because of the threatening notes Laker had received and his unsettling behavior during the investigation. However, it was Brody's arrest that ultimately shifted the focus of the case. Richard was never charged with any crime, but his complicated relationship with his daughter continued to attract public attention. While Richard Green was not involved in Laker's death, the emotional wounds from their strained father-daughter relationship were evident. In the aftermath of Laker's tragic death, the lives of everyone involved were irrevocably altered. Officer Brody's future was destroyed, Cameron's life was marked by loss and regret, and Richard's lingering guilt over his relationship with Laker remained unresolved.